Now, the reason I mention caffeine is that there's a sort of lore out there that if you have a headache, drinking a cup of coffee can eliminate that headache. A few things about that point. First of all, if you are somebody who ingests caffeine every day and you do not ingest caffeine, you will indeed get a headache, and drinking caffeine will relieve that particular headache. So it's absolutely true that caffeine can relieve the lack of caffeine-induced headache. That's sort of a duh, but that leads actually to a very important question, which is why would that be the case? Well, it turns out that caffeine is both a vasodilator and a vasoconstrictor. How does it do that? Well, one of the main ways in which caffeine makes us more alert is that it occupies the receptors for something called adenosine. Adenosine is a molecule that builds up in the brain and body more and more the longer we've been awake. It's one of the things that makes us feel sleepy. So when we drink caffeine, that caffeine occupies the adenosine receptor, and the adenosine cannot have its normal effect of making us sleepy. When that caffeine wears off, the adenosine can bind and we feel sleepy. Adenosine is a vasodilator. So when we drink caffeine, because it blocks the effects of adenosine, there is a vasoconstriction associated with drinking caffeine. However, caffeine is also a vasodilator. Caffeine has the ability to impinge on the so-called NO pathway, the nitric oxide pathway, which is a nerve to blood pathway that involves a few different enzymes that we won't get into right now, but maybe in a future episode, that causes dilation of the blood vessels. And as a consequence, drinking caffeine can also increase vasodilation. So it's sort of a two-pronged effect. Now, one of the ways in which you might think about this and perhaps utilize this is that if you are well rested, or if it's early in the day and you've had some sleep the previous night, adenosine levels are very likely to be low, especially if you slept very well the night before. Under those conditions, drinking coffee ought to lead to some vasodilation. Not a lot, but nonetheless vasodilation. If, however, you haven't slept well or it's late in the day and you've been up for a long time, drinking caffeine is likely to have more of a vasoconstriction effect. And this is important because some of the treatments that you hear about that involve using caffeine to treat headache are as extreme as, okay, if you have a headache at night, drink a cup of coffee and then go to sleep. I actually saw that in the literature, which I couldn't quite believe, because yes, indeed, some people can fall asleep after drinking caffeine, but we know very well, thanks to the beautiful work and science communications of people like Dr. Matthew Walker from University of California, Berkeley, and who's been a guest on this and many other podcasts, that even if you can fall asleep after drinking caffeine, ingesting caffeine within the 10 to 12 hours prior to bedtime is simply not a good idea because of the ways it disrupts the architecture of sleep. So what's the takeaway about caffeine and headache and vasodilation? You need to be very clear on whether or not caffeine tends to remove your headache or exacerbate it. Now, this is going to depend on time of day and the amount of adenosine in your system, as I mentioned before, but also there seems to be a kind of bimodal distribution whereby some people, when they drink caffeine, it really improves their headache. It's in some cases very significant effects, whereas other people, when they drink caffeine, it really exacerbates their headache. And at least as far as I could tell from the literature, it's not easy to predict who those people are going to be. What is reassuring, however, is it does not seem to be the case that if you're somebody who experiences relief from headaches by drinking caffeine, that suddenly one day to the next, you're going to experience a worsening of your headache, and vice versa is also true. So if you're somebody that drinks caffeine and your headaches get worse, I don't think there's any reason to think that caffeine one day, or from one day to the next rather, is going to somehow alleviate your headache. So you have to determine for yourself whether or not headaches are relieved or exacerbated by drinking caffeine. And if you're wondering why it's so confusing, it's because caffeine hits both the vasodilation and the vasoconstriction pathways, and there's nothing you or I or anyone else can do about it.